Imagine two deadly, suspicious monsters facing each other in the dark, each holding a dagger hidden behind their back. That was the atmosphere in August 1939, when two of the most brutal regimes in history, Adolf Hitler's Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union of Joseph Stalin, did the unthinkable, signed a non-aggression pact. It was a theater of hypocrisy and fear. Neither side trusted the other. Hitler hated communism. Stalin despised fascism. But there was something stronger than ideological hatred, the blind ambition for power and strategic expediency. Behind the scenes in Moscow, German and Soviet diplomats sealed what many would call the Pact with the Devil, officially known as Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, in honor of the Ministers of Foreign Affairs, Vyacheslav Molotov from the USSR and Joachim von Ribbentrop from Germany. The agreement stated that the two countries would not attack each other for 10 years, but the real poison was hidden in the secret clauses, a map of Europe, divided like a corpse on an autopsy table. Germany would get the western half of Poland. The Soviet Union would get the eastern half, plus the Baltic states and parts of Finland and Romania. It was the rapist and the murderer sharing the victim's body before the crime even took place. In the dead of night on August 23, 1939, the papers were signed. Stalin toasted with champagne. Ribbentrop smiled. But they both knew that handshake was soaked in blood that was yet to be spilled. A week later, Hitler invaded Poland without fear of Soviet retaliation. 2 days after the invasion, France and the United Kingdom declared war on Germany, and World War II officially began, but Stalin remained silent for now. And on September 17, 1939, like a vulture waiting for the right moment, Stalin also invaded Poland from the east, crushing what remained of resistance. Two mortal enemies, now temporary allies, divided an innocent country and began the collapse of the world order. The pact was a betrayal of humanity, a deal of monsters, a prelude to hell. But neither of them knew that the paper signed in Moscow would be the seed of your destruction. Hitler never planned to respect the agreement. Stalin knew this, but pretended to ignore it. The knife was still in his back. The real war was yet to come, and when it did, it would be the bloodiest chapter in human history. Hitler never intended to keep the pact with Stalin. For him, the Soviet Union was more than a political enemy. He was a racial, ideological, and existential enemy. Communism, in the Führer's poisoned eyes, was a Jewish plague that needed to be eradicated from the face of the earth. And Russia? It was nothing more than a fertile field to be plundered, an empire to be conquered with iron, fire, and blood. Since the time he wrote My Struggle in His Cell, Hitler already dreamed of a German empire that would stretch to the Ural Mountains. He called this plan Habitat, or living space. But this living space had an owner, millions of Slavs whom he considered subhuman. In his twisted mind, it was a simple game: conquer the East, exterminate the unwanted, and colonize the fertile lands with Aryan families. But to do this, Hitler knew he would need an all-out war, and to win it needed surprise, speed, and blind faith in German superiority. While maintaining the guise of peace with Stalin, Hitler and his high command were silently planning the largest military operation ever seen in human history. She would have a cold, hard, heavy name: Operation Barbarossa, named after the medieval emperor who attempted to unify Germanic power. The plan was ambitious to the point of insanity. In just 3 months, the Wehrmacht would crush the Red Army, take Leningrad in the north, Moscow in the center, and Kiev in the south. It was Blitzkrieg on a continental scale. The objective: destroy the Soviet Union before winter arrived. Meanwhile, Stalin refused to believe the signs. Soviet spies sent desperate messages: Germany will attack. But the Georgian leader, paranoid as ever, thought it was British disinformation trying to turn him against Hitler. He wanted more time. Hitler wanted a lightning war. The tension grew every day. German trains poured troops onto the Soviet border. Airfields were crowded. Fuel and ammunition depots were piling up. It was a monster preparing to attack. In Hitler's mind, there was only one certainty. The future of the Third Reich lay in the east. And when he attacked, it would be like ripping the lid off hell. The plan was so monstrous, so gigantic, that it seemed to have been drawn by a mad titan on the map of Europe. Operation Barbarossa was not just an invasion. It was a promise of extermination, of conquest, of annihilation. Hitler gathered more than 3 million German soldiers, 600,000 vehicles, 3,500 tanks, 7,000 artillery pieces, and almost 1,000 Luftwaffe planes. But that wasn't all. More than 600,000 Romanian soldiers, in addition to Finnish, Hungarian, Slovak and even Italian troops, would march alongside the Wehrmacht. Never in all of human history had such a colossal army been mobilized to attack a single enemy. The plan divided the forces into 3 large groups. Army Group North would advance through the Baltic region until capturing Leningrad, the city symbol of the revolution. Army Group Center would go like a blade straight to the heart of the Soviet Union. Moscow, the enemy's brain. Army Group South would cross Ukraine, would take Kiev, would continue to the Caucasus, where lay the precious oil fields that would keep the Nazi war machine running. The strategy was simple and brutal. A rapid, large-scale offensive to destroy Soviet forces at the outset before they could react, before winter froze the rails and bones. Hitler bet everything on Blitzkrieg, lightning war, which had humiliated Poland, devastated France, and paralyzed England. He believed that the Red Army could not resist for more than 6 weeks, and behind the military plan, there was a dark ideology, the systematic extermination. The general plan, Ost, the Nazi master plan for the East, envisaged that tens of millions of Soviets would be killed, deported, or enslaved. Entire cities would disappear. Entire peoples would be erased from history. The war in the East would not be like the previous ones. It would be a war of annihilation, a racial war, a war without rules. As the panzer divisions lined up in the forests of occupied Poland, soldiers were given direct orders to ignore all conventions of war. Political prisoners could be executed. Civilians deemed ideological obstacles would be shot. Jews would be marked for slaughter, and the Einsatzgruppen, death squads, would come right behind. In the early hours of June 21, 1941, German officers toasted in silence. The sky was clear. The silence weighed like lead. At sunrise, the East would burn. In the early hours of June 22, 1941, while millions of Soviets still slept in their homes, the eastern sky exploded in fire, metal, and death. At 3:15 a.m., without any formal declaration of war, the Luftwaffe roared across the skies of the Soviet Union, launching a coordinated air attack against military bases, railways, ammunition depots, and entire cities. Thousands of Soviet planes were destroyed on the ground. Control towers were engulfed in flames. Pilots were burned to death in their cockpits before even attempting takeoff. Runways became cemeteries of steel and bodies. It was an aerial decapitation, quick, precise, cruel. The power of the Nazi Blitzkrieg had been unleashed in all its fury. Along a front of more than 2,900 kilometers, more than 3 million German soldiers crossed the Soviet border like an avalanche. Tanks moved in formation like mechanical predators. Motorized infantry followed behind, crushing the ground, villages, and resistance. The rumble of tracks, the shouts of officers, the incessant sound of gunfire. It was as if hell had been unleashed upon the earth. The Soviet response was chaotic. Command posts were disorganized. Communication lines were cut. Many Red Army divisions didn't even know they were at war until the first shots landed. Some tried to resist, but were brutally crushed. Others surrendered without a fight, lost without orders, abandoned. Stalin, in the Kremlin, refused to believe what he saw. He spent hours in shock, locked in his dacha, mute, motionless, as if waiting to wake from a nightmare. For days, he didn't utter a direct command. His generals were left leaderless. Meanwhile, the Soviet people died by the thousands. The border towns fell one by one. In Bialystok and Minsk, hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers were surrounded. The German units were advancing so fast they could barely keep up with their own supplies. It was carnage. In the field, civilians were desperate. Many fled their villages, but were caught in the crossfire. Others tried to resist with what they had: shovels, sickles, old rifles, and were decimated. Axis troops showed no mercy, and behind the armored divisions came the task forces, the death squads, executing Jews, communists, intellectuals, and anyone who seemed like a threat. Operation Barbarossa had begun with a ferocity never seen before. It was the largest military invasion in human history, and also the beginning of the most brutal conflict of the 20th century. It was the beginning of a war where no rules would be respected, no civilians would be safe, and no life would have value. Hitler thought Moscow would fall within weeks. Stalin, paralyzed by terror, was slow to react, and the Soviet people were alone, bleeding, but still standing. The war that began there, in that dawn covered in smoke and blood, would not end until millions were dead, entire cities destroyed, and the world changed forever. 5. The deadly surprise. The German attack was so sudden, so brutal, and so comprehensive that the Soviet defenses simply crumbled in the first few weeks. It wasn't just a coup, it was a complete collapse of the front line. Entire divisions disappeared. Headquarters were destroyed before they could even issue orders. Soviet soldiers, in many cases, fought without knowing what they were fighting against or why. In a few days, the forces of Army Group Center surrounded Bialystok and Minsk, and more than 400,000 Soviet soldiers were taken prisoner, starving, disarmed, and humiliated. What followed was a grotesque parade of prisoners being pushed along the dusty roads of Belarus under the scorching sun and the cold eyes of German soldiers. Many died before even reaching the concentration camps. For the Nazis, Soviet soldiers were not worthy of rights, they were just disposable meat. Meanwhile, the civilian population plunged into absolute despair. Villages were destroyed, women raped, men executed on charges of sabotage. The Luftwaffe's incessant bombings turned hundreds of towns into smoking ruins. Each column of smoke was a scream of horror rising to the heavens. Children ran aimlessly, clinging to the bodies of their dead mothers. Old people burned alive in houses hit by firebombs. It was as if the gates of hell had been opened and everything was being swallowed inside. But perhaps the deepest blow wasn't physical, it was psychological. Stalin, the man of iron, could not understand. He had trusted the pact, believed he still had time. Now it was too late. His generals begged for orders, but the silence of Moscow was deafening. Even within the Red Army, confusion reigned. Contradictory orders arrived late or not at all. Troops were abandoned in the field, without ammunition, without food, without hope. The German units, with their fast panzer divisions, advanced up to 40 kilometers per day, opening deep wounds in the flesh of the Soviet Union. There was no time to reinforce defenses, reorganize lines, or evacuate civilians. Where the Germans passed, only destruction remained. Soviet tanks burned like giant torches, the skies filled with black smoke, and the roads were covered with bodies and smoking scrap metal. About that, the world watched in silence. England, still trying to recover from the Blitz, could not help. The United States, still neutral, watched with concern. Germany seemed invincible. It was as if fate itself had bowed before the Nazi war machine. But what Hitler didn't know, and neither did Stalin, was that although the body of the Soviet Union was bleeding, the spirit of Soviet resistance had not yet been destroyed. There, Was something there, buried beneath the fear and confusion that would soon explode with fury? For now the surprise was deadly, and the darkness absolute. The Wehrmacht seemed unstoppable. Within weeks, Hitler's armies had crossed hundreds of kilometers of Soviet territory, advancing like a storm of steel. The Blitzkrieg, so well rehearsed in Poland and France, now unfolded in epic proportions on Soviet soil, and with even greater fury. The panzer divisions advanced at breakneck speed, while the tanks crushed everything in their path. The motorized infantry followed, mopping up what remained. Any resistance was crushed with heavy artillery. Luftwaffe planes circled the skies like iron vultures, attacking bridges, train stations, refugee columns, and retreating Soviet convoys. There was no truce, there was no mercy. Within a month, the Germans had already penetrated deep into Belarus, Ukraine, and the Baltic states. Every day, the Soviet lines crumbled further. Important cities fell like dominoes. In many regions, German troops were welcomed by part of the population as liberators, a fatal mistake. Soon, these same liberators began shooting civilians, burning villages, and executing prisoners. The face of the occupier was revealed to be horrific, stained with blood and ideology. The speed of advancement was so absurd that German generals began to fear they were moving too fast for their own supply lines to keep up. But Hitler was obsessed. He studied maps, moved units with blind confidence, and ordered ever-deepening attacks. With each city conquered, he believed that final victory was closer. On the other side, the Red Army was being torn apart. Millions of soldiers had already been killed or captured. The poorly organized defense lines were ineffective. Many units lacked sufficient weapons. In some cases, men were sent into combat with rifles without ammunition, hoping to take weapons from their dead comrades. It was a war of desperation against a well-trained and well-equipped war machine. The camps of the Soviet West were littered with sun-bloated bodies, charred vehicles, and abandoned equipment. Prisoners marched along dust-covered roads, watched by machine guns. Many would die before reaching the prison camps, from hunger, thirst, or simply being shot because they could no longer walk. Nazi propaganda announced an imminent victory. German newspapers spoke of Aryan heroism and the imminent fall of the Bolshevik Empire. But in the trenches, reality was harsher. The Soviet resistance, although disorganized, began to harden. Local troops refused to retreat. Guerrillas appeared in the forests. Saboteurs destroyed trails and bridges. It wasn't a counteroffensive yet, but it was a sign that the Soviet Union would not die so easily. Even so, in the first few weeks, the Wehrmacht seemed invincible, and every kilometer conquered left a trail of destruction, smoke, and blood. Hitler believed that victory would come before winter arrived, but Russia, as all invaders in history have learned too late, is never as easy as it seems. After the first weeks of lightning advance, the Wehrmacht began to execute siege maneuvers with surgical precision, shrouded in violence and destruction. The battles around Minsk and Smolensk became landmarks of the terror that would sweep across the Eastern Front, were massacres disguised as military maneuvers. In Minsk, the capital of Belarus, the speed of the panzer division surprised even the Germans themselves. Soviet troops barely had time to react. The flanks quickly collapsed, and about 300,000 soldiers were surrounded in a matter of days. The Germans closed the rings like a tight noose around a victim's neck. Soviet troops were trapped, cornered, without supplies and with no real chance of escape. The fighting inside the Minsk pocket was brutal. German artillery raked Soviet positions until nothing remained but smoking craters and scattered limbs. Entire groups of soldiers died of starvation or dehydration before they could even take up arms. Those who tried to break through were mowed down by machine gun fire. When the survivors were finally captured, began a ghost march towards the prison camps. They were just human shadows, defeated, mutilated, many carrying dead comrades on their shoulders. Soon after Minsk came the siege of Smolensk, a strategic city between Minsk and Moscow. Here, Soviet resistance was fiercer, but the tragedy was no less. The Germans once again surrounded hundreds of thousands of Red Army soldiers. More than 300,000 men were trapped in forests and valleys, where they crashed desperate battles hand to hand with bayonets, shovels, even stones. It was in Smolensk that the Germans realized something that would change the tone of the war. The Soviets didn't know when to stop. Even surrounded, without water, without ammunition, without hope, many continued fighting until the end. Peasant women picked up abandoned weapons. Officers died, leading suicide charges. Young soldiers with fear and anger in their eyes attacked tanks with hastily made Molotov cocktails. The Wehrmacht won. The Smolensk pocket fell. The prisoners were marched on foot, hundreds of kilometers under the scorching sun and the cruel watch of armed guards. Every few meters, one died. The bodies were left to rot beside the road. On the map, Hitler saw only victories. Millions of soldiers captured, thousands of kilometers conquered, but the most attentive generals were beginning to suspect something. The Soviets did not behave like defeated soldiers. They were tough, almost fanatical. There was a growing ferocity with each new battle. The lightning war was beginning to encounter clouds. The road to Moscow was open, but with every step the Wehrmacht left behind a trail of blood, bones and ghosts, and ahead the enemy began to learn. Stalin's silence in the early days of the invasion had been sepulchral, almost suicidal. But now, faced with colossal losses, cities in ruins, and troops in disorganized retreat, the dictator woke from his trance. And what emerged was not a man. It was a wounded monster. The pain of humiliation turned into hatred. Stalin could not admit weakness. For him, the fall of the front wasn't just the Nazis' fault. It was the fault of his own soldiers. In his paranoid view, cowardice, betrayal, and defeatism were within the Red Army, and he would deal with it with an iron fist. It was in this spirit that one of the most infamous orders of the entire war was born, Order Number 227, issued in July 1942, but whose roots were already being planted there in the horrors of 1941. Although it was not yet formalized, the ideology behind it was already in motion. Not one step back. From that moment on, any soldier who retreated without orders would be considered a traitor. Blocking troops, called barrier detachments, were positioned behind the front lines, not to fight the Germans, but to kill their own compatriots who dared to flee. Deserters were shot on the spot, often in front of their comrades. Officers who hesitated were arrested or executed. Internal terror was added to the terror of the invader. Stalin also began to brutally reorganize the front. Generals who failed were replaced. Some were led directly to their deaths. Soviet propaganda was activated at full force. Posters, radio stations, and newspapers demanded total sacrifice. The people were reminded every minute that this was not just a territorial war, it was a war for the survival of Mother Russia. The arms factories were moved east, beyond the Ural Mountains. Civilians, men, women, and even children, they worked 16, 18, 20 hours a day to produce rifles, tanks, ammunition. As cities were bombed, the Soviet industrial heart beat on ice. The entire country was transformed into a war machine. At the same time, Stalin unleashed a cold fury against the dominated republics. Entire populations were deported, suspected of collaborating with the Germans. Thousands of peasants were killed for failing to deliver grain. It was the logic of total war, where no mistake, no hesitation, no weakness would be tolerated. But paradoxically, it was in this environment of panic, repression, and terror that real Soviet resistance began to emerge. The soldiers stopped fighting just for orders. They began to fight for revenge. The Wehrmacht had humiliated their families, destroyed their homes, massacred their brothers. Now, the fight was not for Stalin, it was for survival. The Red Army began to reorganize. Newly mobilized troops received basic training within weeks and were immediately sent to the front. Entire regiments were composed of peasants who had never held a rifle. But there was a new glint in their eyes. The war was far from over, and the Soviet soil, soaked in blood, was beginning to reject the invader. Order 227 had not yet been signed, but its spirit already reigned. He who retreats dies. He who resists may live. Soviet resistance was being born in the fire, and soon it would become an indestructible wall of flesh, steel, and hatred. As German armored divisions advanced across Soviet soil, a parallel, quieter and darker war was unfolding in the villages, forests and fields of the East. It was the Dirty War, a campaign of extermination, revenge and terror, where the blood of civilians flowed as freely as that of soldiers. Operation Barbarossa was not just a military campaign. It was, in Hitler's mind, a racial war. Russia was, for him, a land of subhumans, of Jews and Slavs who must be destroyed to make way for the Germanic Empire. The goal was not just to defeat the Red Army, was to erase a civilization. With the advance of the Wehrmacht came the task forces, SS death squads. They didn't use tanks. They used trucks, Luger pistols, machine guns and mass graves. Their role was clear: identify, round up and execute Jews, communists, intellectuals, gypsies, and anyone deemed undesirable. Within a few weeks, thousands of villages were wiped off the map. Entire families were torn from their homes, forced to dig their own graves, stripped naked and shot en masse. Small children cried as they watched their parents fall before being killed. Old men were pushed to the edge of the pit with rifle butts. The air smelled of blood, gunpowder and despair. The accounts of the German soldiers themselves, in secret letters, described the horror. We shot 300 today. The children were the last. Most of them were crying. I felt nauseous, but I kept going. Others, more fanatical, boasted fewer enemies for Germany. Every bullet counted. In Babi Yar, a gorge near Kiev, about 33,000 Jews were murdered in just 2 days. It was such a brutal massacre that the ground was soaked and the vultures were unable to devour all the bodies. But the Nazis didn't just kill Jews. Soviet partisans, resistance groups that emerged in the forests and sabotaged trains and communications, were also hunted cruelly. For every German soldier killed by a partisan, entire villages were burned as punishment. Women were raped and murdered, men executed in public squares. And on the other side, the Soviets, when they managed to capture isolated Germans or collaborators, also they showed no mercy. Hangings, mutilations and summary executions became part of everyday wartime. Front Oriental knew no rules. There was no honor. There was no mercy. It was a war of extermination fought in the mud, in the snow, and in the depths of the human soul. For civilians, there was no escape. Those who didn't die from bullets died of hunger. Crops were plundered, food stores destroyed. Winter was approaching, and with it hunger. Starving children ate grass. Women sold their bodies for a piece of bread. Frozen corpses piled up in the corners of the houses. Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union was not just a failed military campaign. It was a genocide in motion. The Dirty War had turned fields into cemeteries and forests into nameless tombs. And all this even before the first winter. The Leningrad saga, 900 days of ice and fire. The siege of Leningrad, one of the most horrific and yet heroic episodes of World War II, remains a grim and inspiring testament to the human capacity to endure the unbearable. For nearly 900 days, Russia's former imperial capital, now St. Petersburg, was trapped in a ring of steel and fire by Axis forces. What unfolded was a frozen hell, a macabre symphony of hunger, extreme cold, and relentless bombardment. This is not just the chronicle of a battle, but the saga of a city that refused to die. A story of sacrifice, pain, and the indomitable strength of the human spirit that refused to be extinguished. The beginning of the nightmare, the shadow of Blitzkrieg, In the summer of 1941, the Nazi war machine, at the height of its power, turned eastward. Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, was unleashed with overwhelming fury. Among the three major axes of advance, Army Group North, under the command of Field Marshal Wilhelm Ritter von Lieb, had a clear and relentless mission to capture Leningrad. For Hitler, the city was not just a military objective, it was an ideological prize. As the birthplace of the Bolshevik Revolution, Leningrad represented the symbolic heart of communism, a vital industrial center, and the base of the mighty Baltic Fleet. Its annihilation would be a devastating blow to Soviet morale and a strategic victory of immense value. The German advance was breathtakingly fast. The Blitzkrieg, or lightning war, tactics that had crushed the defenses of Western Europe, proved equally lethal on the vast Russian plains. Panzer divisions, like steel spearheads, tore through the Soviet lines, which, caught by surprise and ill-prepared for such a large-scale defensive war, crumbled. Within weeks, German forces, with crucial support from their Finnish allies to the north, who sought to reclaim territories lost in the Winter War, reached the gates of Leningrad. The city, once pulsating with life and culture, suddenly found itself cornered, with the enemy's noose tightening by the day. The steel ring closes. The imprisoned city. On September 8, 1941, Leningrad's fate was sealed. The last land routes connecting the city to the rest of the Soviet Union were cut. The ring of steel and fire was complete. Within its boundaries, nearly 3 million souls, including hundreds of thousands of refugees who had fled the German advance, found themselves trapped. Hitler's plan was diabolical in its simplicity. The city would not be taken in a direct assault, which would cost the lives of precious German soldiers in bloody urban combat. Instead, Leningrad would be systematically annihilated by hunger and cold. A slow, agonizing death sentence was passed on one of the largest and most beautiful cities in the world. Almost immediately, the skies over Leningrad transformed into a nightmare. The Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, began a relentless bombing campaign, while heavy artillery, positioned on the hills surrounding the city, rained down shells day and night. The sound of air raid sirens, followed by the ominous whistle of bombs and the thunder of explosions, became the constant soundtrack of life in the besieged city. Historic buildings, hospitals, schools, and residential apartments were targeted indiscriminately. With each passing day, the urban landscape was transformed into a graveyard of rubble, and the death toll rose exponentially. The city's vital infrastructure, water, sewage, and electricity systems was systematically destroyed, plunging Leningrad into a medieval darkness and exacerbating the already dire sanitary conditions. Hunger as a weapon, the winter of ice and death. The winter of 1941-1942 descended on Leningrad with unrelenting ferocity, transforming the siege into an apocalypse of hunger and cold that claimed most lives. With all supply routes cut, food supplies quickly depleted. Rations were drastically reduced to subsistence, levels that could barely sustain life. Bread, once the staple of the diet, became a nearly inedible mixture of rye flour, cellulose, sawdust, and even wallpaper, offering minimal nutritional value. Hunger became a silent but relentless epidemic, transforming the inhabitants into walking specters with sunken eyes and wasting bodies consumed by starvation. The intense cold of the Russian winter, with temperatures frequently dropping to 30 degrees and sometimes reaching 40 degrees, further aggravated the situation. Without fuel for heating, homes became icy traps, running water froze, and electricity was cut off, plunging the city into a freezing, paralyzing darkness. People were forced to burn furniture, books, wooden floors, and anything that could generate even a modicum of heat to survive. The search for water and firewood became a dangerous and exhausting expedition, often resulting in more deaths from exhaustion or freezing. The bodies of the dead, many of them victims of hunger and cold, piled up in the streets as there was neither the energy nor the resources to bury them properly. Mass graves became a common sight, and human dignity was tested to the limit. In extreme cases, cannibalism, though rare and severely punished, emerged as a grim reality, a testament to the depths of despair. The city had become an open-air cemetery, with death lurking around every corner, and the line between life and death became increasingly blurred. The road of life, an artery of hope in the ice. Faced with imminent catastrophe and the impossibility of breaking the siege by land, the Soviets refused to give in to despair. Instead, they conceived and implemented one of the most remarkable and heroic logistical operations in history, the legendary Road of Life, Doroga Zhizny. This vital route, which crossed the frozen Lake Ladoga, became Leningrad's only artery to the outside world. During the winter months, when the lake was solidly frozen, convoys of trucks and sleds transported precious supplies, food, fuel, ammunition, medicine to the besieged city. On the return journey, these same vehicles evacuated children, the sick, the wounded and the elderly, saving hundreds of thousands of lives from the hell of Leningrad. The Road of Life operation was extremely dangerous and required superhuman courage. The lake's ice was treacherous, constantly threatened by German air and artillery bombardments aimed at cutting this lifeline. Many trucks and their drivers sank in the icy waters of Ladoga, victims of thin ice, bombs or exhaustion. However, the determination to keep the route open was unwavering. Military engineers worked tirelessly to monitor ice thickness, build makeshift bridges, and clear paths, while Soviet air defense forces fought to protect the convoys from enemy attacks. The Road of Life was not just a supply route. It was a symbol of hope, resilience, and the Soviet ability to improvise and resist under the most adverse conditions. A true miracle of engineering and heroism amidst devastation, the unshakable resistance, the indomitable spirit of Leningrad. Despite unspeakable suffering and the constant threat of annihilation, the people of Leningrad and its defenders demonstrated an unwavering resilience that became legendary. This wasn't just passive resilience, but an active and determined organization to defend the city at any cost. Soldiers, civilians, men, women, and even children joined forces in a collective effort to transform Leningrad into an impenetrable fortress, a bastion of defiance against Nazi barbarity. Factories, many operating under constant bombardment and with minimal resources, continued to produce weapons, ammunition, and military equipment vital to the defense. Exhausted, hungry, and freezing workers, often sleeping at their posts, maintained production, knowing that every shell and tank manufactured meant a new chance of survival for the city. Thousands of civilians, including women and the elderly, were mobilized to build defensive lines, dig trenches, erect barricades, and install anti-tank traps around the city, transforming every street and square into a potential battlefield. The heroism of Leningrad's defenders was legendary. The exhausted and starving Red Army troops fiercely resisted every German assault, defending every inch of ground with their lives. The civilian population, for its part, not only supported the war effort, but actively participated in the defense, putting out fires caused by the bombings, caring for the wounded, and organizing surveillance patrols. Solidarity and community spirit flourished amidst the chaos, with neighbors helping neighbors, sharing what little they had, and offering mutual support. The determination not to give in, not to allow Leningrad to fall into enemy hands, was a fire that burned in every heart, fueled by the belief in victory and the defense of the homeland. Culture and art also became forms of resistance. Concerts and plays were held amid the bombings, and Shostakovich's Seventh Symphony, composed during the siege, became a universal anthem of resistance and hope, performed in the besieged city as an act of defiance, the price of victory and the eternal legacy. The siege of Leningrad, which lasted 872 days from September 8, 1941 to January 27, 1944, became one of the most prolonged and devastating sieges in modern history. When the Iron Ring finally broke, thanks to a determined Soviet offensive, the human toll was staggering. Over 1 million civilians perished, the vast majority succumbing to hunger, cold, and disease, a number that exceeds the combined military casualties of many nations during the entire Second World War. Leningrad was not merely besieged, it was subjected to a deliberate policy of extermination, an attempt to annihilate its population through starvation. The victory in Leningrad, however, transcended the military sphere. It was a monumental triumph of human will over the most brutal adversity. The city, despite all predictions and the enemy's cruelty, did not fall. Its unwavering resistance thwarted Hitler's plans to wipe out one of the Soviets' main cultural and industrial centers. The heroic defense of Leningrad immobilized a significant number of German and Finnish divisions, preventing them from being redeployed to other crucial fronts, such as the Battle of Moscow, altering the course of the war in the East. In recognition of this unprecedented bravery, Leningrad was the first city to receive the title of Hero City in 1965, an eternal symbol of the Soviet people's resilience. The end of the siege marked a decisive turning point on the Eastern Front. It demonstrated the Red Army's growing ability to launch successful offensives and break through German defensive lines. The liberation of Leningrad not only saved millions of lives, but also boosted morale throughout the Soviet Union, proving that victory over the Nazi invader was not only possible, but inevitable. The legacy of the siege of Leningrad is multifaceted and deeply rooted in the collective memory. It is a story of unimaginable horror and suffering, but also of extraordinary heroism, solidarity, and resilience. It served as a powerful symbol of Soviet resistance against the Nazi invasion, inspiring the nation to fight until ultimate victory. The memory of those who perished and those who survived is kept alive through imposing monuments, moving museums, and ongoing historical research, ensuring that the lessons of Leningrad about the brutality of total war, the importance of solidarity and determination in the face of annihilation are never forgotten. The city of Leningrad, though forever marked by the scars of the siege, has emerged as a beacon of courage and an eternal testament to the strength of the human spirit. Conclusion: an eternal testimony to human resilience. The siege of Leningrad remains one of the darkest and, paradoxically, most inspiring chapters of World War II. For 872 days, the city and its inhabitants faced an unimaginable ordeal, subjected to a strategy of annihilation by hunger and cold, combined with incessant bombardments. Leningrad's history is a testament to the brutality of total war and the dehumanization it can inflict. Yet above all, it is a saga of extraordinary resilience, collective sacrifice, and the unwavering will of a people to resist annihilation. The road of life on Lake Ladoga, the continued production of armaments under enemy fire, the maintenance of cultural life amidst the desolation, and the fierce determination of each citizen to defend their city are vivid examples of Leningrad's indomitable spirit. The final victory, though achieved at a staggering human cost, not only saved the city, but also had a crucial strategic impact on the Eastern Front, thwarting Nazi plans and contributing to the eventual Allied triumph. The legacy of the Siege of Leningrad transcends military history, becoming a universal symbol of the human capacity to endure the unbearable and to find hope and solidarity, even in the most desperate circumstances. The memory of those who perished and those who survived is kept alive through monuments, museums, and ongoing historical research, ensuring that the lessons of Leningrad, the importance of peace, solidarity, and resistance against tyranny, are never forgotten. The city of Leningrad, now St. Petersburg, remains a beacon of courage and an eternal testament to the strength of the human spirit. Kiev, the bloody trap of the East. As the icy embrace of death tightened on Leningrad, thousands of miles to the south, in the vast and fertile plains of Ukraine, another tragedy of epic proportions unfolded. Kiev, Ukraine's ancient and venerable capital, a strategic and symbolic center of inestimable value to the Soviet Union, became the stage for one of the largest and most brutal encirclement battles in military history. For Adolf Hitler, the capture of Kiev was not just a military objective, it was a decisive step toward annihilating the Red Army in the south and, crucially, securing control over the region's vital agricultural and industrial resources, which would be instrumental in sustaining the Reich's war effort. What followed was no mere battle, but a death trap, a carefully orchestrated slaughter by the Wehrmacht that would result in one of the bloodiest massacres of World War II. The relentless advance and Hitler's vision. In the summer of 1941, Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, was advancing with unprecedented ferocity. The Wehrmacht's Army Group South, led by experienced commanders, swept away Soviet resistance with the brutal efficiency of a Blitzkrieg. Ukraine, with its vast expanses of fertile land and rich agricultural production, was a coveted prize. Kyiv, in particular, was a vital railway hub, an industrial center, and a symbol of Ukrainian and Soviet identity. Hitler, in his megalomania, saw the conquest of Kyiv as an essential step toward dismantling Soviet war capability and paving the way for the exploitation of Eastern resources. Contrary to the advice of his generals, who advocated a direct advance on Moscow, Hitler diverted a significant portion of his forces south, convinced that the destruction of the Red Army in Ukraine and the capture of Kyiv were absolute priorities. This decision, though controversial at the time, led to the creation of one of the largest concentrations of military forces in history, setting the stage for the trap that would close on Soviet troops. The German strategy was clear: encircle and annihilate enemy forces in large pockets, depriving the Red Army of its most valuable men and equipment. The trap closes. The siege of millions. In August 1941, the German strategy began to materialize on a terrifying scale. The Wehrmacht's pincers, coming from the north and south, converged with brutal precision. Guderian's 2nd Panzer Army, coming from the north, and Gleist's 1st Panzer Army, coming from the south, executed a classic pincer maneuver, closing in on a vast contingent of Soviet troops. An estimated 600,000 Red Army soldiers belonging to the Southwestern Front under the command of General Mikhail Kirponos were trapped in a gigantic pocket east of Kyiv. The city, once a refuge, became an open-air prison. The Soviet command, under Stalin's leadership, had hesitated to allow the withdrawal of troops from Kiev, fearing a moral and strategic blow. This fatal decision condemned hundreds of thousands of men to almost certain death. Within the encirclement, the situation was desperate. Communication lines were cut. The supply of food, ammunition, and medical equipment ceased. Hope of escape was virtually non-existent. The Wehrmacht, with its air superiority and overwhelming artillery, turned the Kiev pocket into a slaughterhouse. Aerial bombardments and incessant German artillery attacks rained down on the trapped Soviet troops, transforming the battlefield into a hell of fire and shrapnel. With each passing day, the encirclement area shrank and the density of Soviet troops increased, making them easy targets for German artillery and aviation. The massacre and the harvest of death. What followed the closing of the encirclement was a massacre of terrifying proportions. German troops, with their discipline and firepower, advanced on the trapped Soviet forces. Brutal hand-to-hand combat, ambushes, and bloody clashes became the norm. Soviet resistance, though desperate and courageous, was futile in the face of Germany's overwhelming superiority in organization, supplies, and coordination. Thousands of Red Army soldiers were killed in action, their bodies scattered across the fields and forests of Ukraine. Lack of food, water and ammunition sapped the defenders' fighting capacity, making them easy prey for the Nazi war machine. For those who didn't fall in combat, the fate was equally grim. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers were taken prisoner, a number unprecedented in military history. These exhausted, starving and demoralized men were subjected to forced marches in inhumane conditions. Many died of exhaustion, hunger, thirst and disease before even reaching the prison camps. The makeshift concentration camps where they were confined were veritable hells on earth, with deplorable sanitary conditions, lack of food and water, and brutal treatment by German guards. The Nazi policy of racial and ideological extermination manifested itself in the treatment of Soviet prisoners of war, resulting in a shocking mortality rate. The total death toll among Soviets, both military and civilian, in the Battle of Kiev and its aftermath is estimated at a staggering 700,000, making it one of the greatest human and military tragedies of World War II. Consequences and the prelude to a titanic struggle. The German victory in Kiev was undoubtedly a military achievement of gigantic proportions. The Wehrmacht had inflicted a crushing defeat on the Red Army, capturing an unprecedented number of prisoners and eliminating a considerable fighting force. However, this victory came at a tremendous cost, both in terms of resources and time. The diversion of forces to Kiev delayed the German advance towards Moscow, the Soviet capital, a delay that would prove fatal with the onset of the Russian winter. For the Red Army, the defeat in Kiev was a devastating blow, a moment of profound humiliation and loss. Yet paradoxically, it also served as a catalyst. The brutality of the siege, the scale of the losses, and the cruelty displayed by the Nazi invaders solidified the conviction that the war would be long, bloody, and merciless. The need for even fiercer resistance, for a total defense of the homeland, became unquestionable. The lessons learned in Kiev, though painful, were crucial to the reorganization and hardening of Soviet forces. The siege of Kiev, with its carnage and strategic consequences, marked the prelude to the titanic struggle that would unfold in the following months. The German advance, which seemed unstoppable, would begin to encounter the limits of the unforgiving terrain, the brutal climate, and above all, the unbreakable spirit of the Soviet people. The victory in Kiev, though celebrated in Germany, was a bloody triumph that foreshadowed the difficulties the Wehrmacht would face in the Russian winter, a winter that would become the grave of its ambitions. For swift and decisive conquest, Soviet resistance, forged in the crucible of Kiev, was only beginning to show its true strength, setting the stage for the epic battles that would define the fate of the Eastern Front and ultimately World War II. Moscow, the heart of the resistance and the unyielding winter. After the lightning advances that swept across vast swaths of Soviet territory and the brutal sieges that engulfed entire armies in Minsk, Smolensk and Kyiv, the Wehrmacht, the Nazi war machine, turned its hungry eyes to the ultimate prize, Moscow. The capital of the Soviet Union, the nerve center of political and military power, and the symbolic heart of the nation, became the ultimate objective of Operation Barbarossa. Adolf Hitler, in his arrogance and unshakable conviction, believed that the fall of Moscow would be the fatal blow, the final defeat of the Red Army, and consequently, the end of the war in the East. He saw the city not only as a strategic objective, but as the turning point that would seal the fate of the Soviet Union and pave the way for Nazi hegemony in Eastern Europe. What would unfold on the outskirts of the former capital would be a battle of epic proportions, a confrontation that would not only define the future of warfare, but also test the limits of human endurance and the brutality of conflict. The march to the capital, Operation Typhoon. In October 1941, German forces under Army Group Center launched Operation Typhoon, the final offensive, to capture Moscow. After months of incessant fighting and crushing victories, German troops were exhausted, but their morale remained high. They believed victory was within reach. In a stunning advance, panzer spearheads and infantry divisions managed to break through the initial Soviet defenses, creating new pockets and capturing hundreds of thousands of prisoners. Within weeks, the German vanguard was less than 30 kilometers from the Moscow suburbs, so close that soldiers could see the golden domes of the Kremlin in the distance. Panic spread in the capital, and many government officials and civilians were evacuated. It seemed nothing could stop the Nazi advance. However, the city and its defenders were far from surrendering. Moscow, with its ancient history and profound significance to the Russian people, would not be surrendered without a desperate fight. Soviet propaganda tirelessly urged the population to defend the homeland, evoking the spirit of resistance that had repelled invaders for centuries. The city prepared for a siege and a battle that would decide the fate of the nation. The living fortress, Soviet defense and total mobilization. Under the iron leadership of Joseph Stalin and the strategic genius of generals like Georgy Zhukov, the defense of Moscow was organized with unprecedented ferocity and determination. The city was transformed into a living fortress, where every street, every building, every square meter of land would be defended to the last man. Thousands of civilians, including women, the elderly, and teenagers, were mobilized in a colossal effort to build defensive lines. Deep trenches were dug, fortified bunkers were erected, anti-tank barriers were installed, and minefields were spread throughout the city's outskirts. The people of Moscow, aware of the gravity of the situation, worked tirelessly, day and night, under the biting cold and the constant threat of air raids, to transform their capital into an impenetrable barrier. The regular Red Army troops, though exhausted and battered by previous fighting, were reinforced by fresh divisions, many of them transferred from the Far East, where Soviet intelligence had confirmed that Japan would not attack. These troops, fresh and well-equipped, would be crucial to the counteroffensive. Furthermore, popular militias formed by civilian volunteers were hastily armed and trained, ready to defend their homes and families. The spirit of resistance was palpable, a mixture of fervent patriotism and visceral hatred of the Nazi invader. The city under siege breathed the determination not to yield, not to allow Moscow to fall into enemy hands. The ice general, the Russian winter, and the turning point. When the Wehrmacht was just a few kilometers from Moscow, nature intervened with a brutal and relentless force, the Russian winter. Known by the Russians themselves as General Ice, the winter of 1941-1942 arrived early and with unusual intensity. Temperatures plummeted to glacial levels, often below 30 degrees C and sometimes reaching 40 degrees C. Blizzards were incessant, covering the landscape in a white shroud and turning roads into traps of frozen mud and slippery ice. The Wehrmacht, accustomed to summer campaigns and lightning warfare, was catastrophically unprepared for such adversity. The German soldiers' summer uniforms offered little protection against the biting cold, resulting in thousands of cases of frostbite, gangrene, and hypothermia. Weapons and vehicles, designed for temperate climates, jammed and refused to function. Lubricating oils froze, engines wouldn't start, and the steel in weapons became brittle. German logistics, already stretched to the limit by the vast distances and Soviet resistance, collapsed completely. Supplies were not arriving, and hunger and disease spread among the troops. The German advance, previously unstoppable, slowed dramatically, and the initiative began to slip from their grasp. It was against this backdrop of chaos and despair for the Germans that the Soviet counteroffensive was launched on December 5, 1941. Under the masterful command of generals such as Zhukov, Konev, and Rokossovsky, hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers, many of them newly recruited and equipped with proper winter uniforms and weapons manufactured in factories relocated to the east, advanced. These troops, including Siberian divisions accustomed to the extreme cold, were fresh and determined. The counteroffensive was a shock to the Germans, who expected the winter to paralyze Soviet forces as well. However, the Soviets, with their experience in winter combat and their capacity for mass mobilization, turned the cold into their ally. The fighting was bloody, brutal, and desperate. Every street, every house, every tree on the outskirts of Moscow became a stage for hand-to-hand combat. The German soldiers, exhausted, frozen, and with their morale shattered, were pushed back. The German retreat, while not a complete rout, was chaotic and cost the Wehrmacht immense numbers of men and equipment. The Battle of Moscow was not merely a defensive victory. It was the Wehrmacht's first major defeat of World War II, a devastating blow to the Nazi aura of invincibility. The turning point, aftermath and legacy of the Battle of Moscow. The German defeat in Moscow was a devastating blow to Adolf Hitler and the morale of the Nazi troops. For the first time since the beginning of World War II, the German war machine encountered a barrier it could not break. Belief in Blitzkrieg as an infallible strategy was shaken, and the illusion of a quick victory over the Soviet Union crumbled. Hitler's war plan, which called for the fall of Moscow before winter, failed spectacularly, forcing the Wehrmacht into a war of attrition for which it was unprepared. For the Soviet Union, the victory in Moscow was a triumph of immense proportions. Not only was the capital saved, but the battle demonstrated the Red Army's ability to resist, and more importantly, to counterattack. It boosted the nation's morale and proved to the world that the Soviet Union would not be easily subdued. The Battle of Moscow marked a crucial turning point on the Eastern Front. From that point on, the war in the East would enter a new chapter, a brutal war of attrition, where Soviet resistance gained strength by the day, and the road to Berlin, though still long and bloody, became increasingly clear to the defenders. The legacy of the Battle of Moscow is profound. It not only saved the Soviet capital, but also altered the course of World War II. Germany's inability to defeat the Soviet Union in a single swift campaign forced it to fight a war on two fronts, a strategic error that doomed the German Empire in World War I. The Battle of Moscow is a testament to the resilience of the Soviet people, the effectiveness of defense in depth, and the importance of the Russian winter as an unexpected ally. It remains a symbol of the unwavering resolve of a nation that refused to be conquered, a grim reminder of the horrors of war, but also of the human capacity for heroism and sacrifice in the face of the most extreme adversity. As winter lashed Moscow and forced the Wehrmacht to retreat, the southern Soviet Union became the scene of a new and brutal struggle for control of the Caucasus region and its precious oil reserves. The name that would soon become synonymous with horror and fierce resistance was Stalingrad. The city, situated on the banks of the Volga River, was more than a strategic point. It was a symbol of the Soviet struggle against the Nazi invasion. Hitler wanted to conquer Stalingrad, to cut off Soviet supply routes and weaken the morale of the Russian people, as well as to secure control of essential resources for his war machine. In mid-1942, fighting began with unprecedented violence. The streets of Stalingrad quickly became trenches and battlefields, where every building, every corner was fought over with visceral hatred. German and Soviet soldiers fought hand-to-hand battles, often with their bare hands, knives, and pieces of metal. The city was reduced to smoking ruins, an apocalyptic scene of despair and destruction. The Soviet resistance, motivated by Stalin's order to not give a step, demonstrated an almost supernatural determination. Civilians joined the fighters, builders became soldiers, and no one gave up. The siege of the city lasted months. Thousands of soldiers died in brutal fighting amid extreme conditions of cold, hunger, and disease. Bodies piled up in heaps as the battle became a symbol of the relentless brutality of warfare in the East. The Battle of Stalingrad would be the turning point of the Second World War, proof that the Soviet Union was willing to pay the highest price to defeat the invader. The Battle of Stalingrad was one of the bloodiest in history, fought in brutal fighting in the streets, rubble, and factories of the destroyed city. Soviet soldiers used urban, guerrilla tactics against the Wehrmacht, which advanced with frontal attacks, suffering heavy losses. Intense cold, hunger, and disease worsened the situation for both sides, while civilians faced bombing and poverty. Operation Uranus trapped the German Sixth Army inside the city, tightening the siege. Lacking supplies and facing a cruel winter, the Sixth Army was trapped, and Hitler forbade any retreat, condemning his troops to a slow and painful agony. In January 1943, General Paulus surrendered, marking the greatest German defeat of the war. This fall shattered the myth of Nazi invincibility and represented the beginning of Germany's decline in the East, with the tide of the war turning in favor of the Allies.